Welcome to the Neurology Live Mind Moments podcast. Tune in to hear leaders in neurology sound off on topics that impact your clinical practice. I'm your host, Marco Meglio, editor with Neurology Live. In this episode, we sat down with former FDA Commissioner Dr. Robert Califf at the 2025 MDA Clinical and Scientific Conference to discuss funding efforts in neuromuscular disorders. Califf, an adjunct professor of medicine at Duke University, spoke on the need for sustained funding to advance basic and translational research, including for things like gene editing, assistive devices, and the integration of AI. He also talked about the community spirit for those working in the neuromuscular field, where shared technologies and insights can address multiple disorders. Above all, he talked about the considerations clinicians and families should have as more therapeutics emerge, as well as the need for innovative funding solutions to address the high costs of treatment. Let's dive in.
You know, that's a very interesting question to be asking right now, because you can pretty much take what's happening and reverse engineer it and go where I think we need to go. At the very basic level, we still need fundamental basic science, so the NIH needs to keep its funding, which is very much being threatened right now. And I think particularly for the kind of diseases we're talking about at the MDA, I think we need to really be studying how genes interact and how they interact in the human condition, whether it's in human tissue, models of human tissue which are evolving rapidly, or in the intact human being. So that basic research still is very important. And then we need translational research. How do you take those ideas and develop technologies which can eventually lead to effective interventions of various types, whether it's anything from gene editing to taking gene function and enhancing it or knocking it down. Or even in many of these patients, devices are very important. We didn't talk much about devices today in my part of the meeting, but if you look at people who have diminished muscular function, the device world is so absolutely critical to them, and there's a lot of work to be done there. So engineering is a very important part of this. And of course, bringing it all together these days is AI, which is the ultimate synthetic method of bringing multiple streams of information and data together. So we have to be funding all of that. But then on the other side, the clinical care system is very much under stress right now, as our health systems and insurance companies have increasingly fine-tuned their effort to make a financial margin. Often the patients who need help the most are not the ones in which you make money. And so we're seeing real concerns about things like Medicaid, which are essential to disabled people. Such a high proportion are dependent on Medicaid funding, so if that funding is diminished. So you asked about the funding. I pretty much laid out where I think it needs to go. The opposite is sort of happening right now. You know, I'd add to it the issue of diversity. That word is not even allowed now in a federal grant, and yet we know that if we just look at our human population, there are groups of people who do much worse than others. You know, for example, rural people do much worse than urban people now. Those without a college degree do 8 years shorter life expectancy compared to those with. So if we don't acknowledge that there are real differences in expected outcomes, how are we going to fix them? And I think we've got to restore funding to acknowledge the issues we have with health outcomes and then have plans to do something about it.
I think you bring up a lot of great points, especially some of the aspects about translational research. We've got a lot of great things sort of on the shelf right now that are in development. How do we get them to clinical care, and how do we continue to advance them is definitely a challenge, to say the least, but a good challenge ahead of us. I'm also curious, we've talked a lot about, funding, but what excites you about the neuromuscular community and the ability to work so closely together? It seems like there's obviously a lot of different disorders and diseases that get represented here at MDA, and there's a lot of cross-collaboration. So what excites you about the neuromuscular community in that aspect specifically?
Well, I think the main thing is the human interactions that occur at a meeting like this and then throughout the year. Fundamentally, human disease is something that demands that we work together as human beings. We don't solve problems as individuals in areas like this. It takes teamwork of different kinds of people, the scientists, the clinicians, the families, the patients. And when I say clinicians, I don't just mean doctors, I mean nurses and physical therapists and respiratory therapists, et cetera. So this is all really important and a key feature of this particular organization and community. Having said all that, we still are dependent on the funding for high quality science. And a key area where I think people are taking advantage of this now in this community is that we have more and more technologies that can be platforms. I mean, you mentioned that we have many different neuromuscular diseases. Many of them have similarities in that they're genetically based, and so the technologies that allow for gene editing, for example, if someone working on a therapy for one disease figures out how to do gene editing better, that accrues to the benefit of all the others. So all the more reason to be communicating as frequently as possible about this.
Mm-hmm. So Dr. Califf, obviously there is more therapeutics that are starting to come into the fold, including things like gene therapy, which has a lot of conversations around it, and the discussions between patients and clinicians are going to be very, very important over the next couple of years. So as more drugs continue to come into the fold for these disorders, what will the clinical and patient communities need to keep in mind? Talk a lot about any considerations with these new therapeutics coming on the rise.
Well, there's so many considerations. Just to mention a couple that are on my mind right now, we don't have enough clinicians. If you look at the explosion of therapeutic options for people, these are not things that happen in a vacuum. You need an interaction between a patient and a clinician to make these decisions. And then if a therapy is administered, they're not so simple. There's sometimes really serious risk in these treatments. So we got to train more clinicians and make it so their lives are positive. They're under great duress right now, what's been called moral injury. They don't have the time to do the things they need to do now, and then we're going to add more exciting possible therapies, which is a great thing. But we got to have enough clinicians to do the work. Second thing is, just by the nature of these issues, we won't know everything that we'd like to know at the time the treatments are on the market when they're available. And so we're going to have a systematic way of learning in the post-market phase with these interventions. It means that people need to volunteer to work together. MDA has its clinical care centers. Hopefully people will volunteer their electronic health records and digital information they can collect so they can be followed over time to learn. I mean, just one example that I've been talking with people about recently in common diseases, very pertinent to the situation here. Let's say we have what might be considered a monogenic disease. There's one mutation or one gene which is responsible for the disease. And then we edit that gene. What we don't know is how all the other genes are going to interact with that newly created genome. And that could evolve over time. It may be years before we see what happens. And like so many things in medicine, it could be either really, really good or it could be a problem that needs to be dealt with. So we need a detection system that can figure that out. In the short term, there'll just be very hard decisions to make in the face of uncertainty. It's going to be really important for the advocates to work with the clinical and the financial community to come up with a way of funding these treatments. Let's say we develop effective treatments for 1,000 rare diseases over the next year. If it's going to be 1 to 2 million per dose, that's not going to be viable. We're going to need some better way using, as I said, platforms and working together to solve these problems.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Neurology Live Mind Moments podcast. To support this show, be sure to rate review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, for more neurology news and expert-driven content, visit neurologylive.com.